explicitly said that I am up for any questions about St. Paul, and then people pull that stunt, or 1 Corinthians 11:2 following, or whatever. And Joe, I would really like time out to go and look and see what I said in 1 Corinthians for everyone about that passage. Because there are several quite different things going on. There is the question of discipline within the church. There is, I mean, that as a framework question. There is a question of correlated with that of the holiness, the necessary holiness of the church, if the church is to be the church. There is a question of how you put that alongside the later discussions of adiaphora in 1 Corinthians 8 and so on, and why Paul thinks this is not adiaphora but other things are. But then there is a question of what sort of salvation does Paul envisage? And in the light of the whole letter, particularly 1 Corinthians 15, it's quite clear to me that he does not envisage a Platonic disembodied spirit or soul leaving physicality behind. For Paul, as you know, flesh, sarx, is the corruptible, decaying body, and he's saying this guy is buying into a world of corruptible flesh, i.e. his sexual immorality is exhibiting all the signs of what in Galatians he calls the works of the flesh, to sarkos. And okay, if that's the route he's going, that's the route he needs to be shown he's going, in order that he may be saved. And then in the next chapter we get stuff about the body, what the body is made for, and the Lord is going to redeem the body. So you have to take that thing whole. The more interesting thing, and I suspect that this is why you pulled it up in this conversation, but I couldn't get to it without going through those bits first, is that Paul is absent and yet is saying, it is as though I'm present. And Paul's equivalent of a text message is a text message called a letter, an epistle. And Paul has quite a high theology of a letter as making him present. And that has to be mapped onto first century Hellenistic beliefs about the way in which a letter could make somebody, in a sense, present. And people had reflected about that, not just Christians obviously, but plenty of people in the ancient world for whom, in the absence of electronic communications, a letter was really virtually the only substitute available for a personal presence. We have several different options, telephone calls, radio, whatever. They only had letters, so there was a sense of a letter as a substitute for the personal presence, and sometimes a very powerful substitute. And then, of course, Paul has to wrestle with the fallout from precisely that point in 2 Corinthians, where they are saying, yeah, his letters are very powerful, but when he turns up, actually he's a bit of a wimp. And so Paul has to come around that loop as well. So it's interesting because I had thought, and I didn't say it, that if there was a first century equivalent of being present but not being present, it would be the letter. And so it comes back to the centre of your question. The answer is, don't know what I really think about that. Just that maybe in the economy of God, we shouldn't be shy of embracing ways of being present to one another which are not the full person being physically present, but nor should we actually mistake those for the ultimate reality of being physically present. Sorry, long question, but...
that's fine. There are 34 people present with us in one sense.
Hi guys.
Online.
Hi. It's been said that what the internet has done over the last couple of decades has changed a handful of markets, economically, a handful of markets made of millions of people into millions of markets made of a few people. And it's the same with mindsets or worldviews as well. A British person 30 years ago may have come across a handful of worldviews, only religiously or politically based. And now with the rise of the internet being easily accessible, there are millions of worldviews. What do you think what challenges do you think that faces Christendom as a worldview? And what are your thoughts on how the prevalence of understandings of the world around us might affect Christendom?
May I just check, when you say Christendom, do you mean Christianity or Christendom with a capital C?
Yeah, I suppose I mean Christian theology, what Christianity has to say about the world around us.
Because when I hear Christendom, I hear something that sort of is putatively supposed to last from Constantine till the 18th century. Now, I don't actually quite buy that myth, but let's just park that and get back to, challenges to Christianity. Christianity was born into a world full of gods, a world of pluriform worldviews, and made its way, and you see it in Acts the whole time, made its way in a world where there were lots of different variants on all sorts of things. Now, I suspect that actually this is one of those cases where, yes, there are many options, but actually you can frame them within some basic answers to some basic questions. And historians, like everybody else, come and go with this. You study the pluriformity, and then patterns start to emerge. Then you name the patterns, and then somebody else later on says, wait a minute, that was too restrictive, we see more pluriformity. But then new, big pictures emerge. And that is really the kind of ongoing dialogue between Plato and Aristotle, if you like. Plato seeing the big picture, and Aristotle saying, no, there's all this fun stuff as well. But then, so I'm not too worried about that. And actually, I think it's very, very healthy for Christian theology to be reminded that its natural habitat is not within a world where there are just one or two or three worldviews, but within a world where there is massive pluriformity, and where that is contested, and where it mixes with power structures, with ideology, with bits and pieces of economic pressures and so on. I'm reading a book at the moment, a joking little book by Peter Jones, the classicist from Newcastle, not called The Romans Had a Word for it, it's called Vote for Caesar, which is looking at the first century world and the way they handled things like traffic control, public sport, etc., 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 and letting that bounce off the way we do it. And, you know, they were very pluriform. They had all these issues and they coped with it in a variety of ways. So Christian theology says, actually, there is one God who made the world, but this one God was hugely prodigal in the way he did it, and let's celebrate the pluriformity, but work towards glimpse in Christ and celebrate the unity of the pluriform. And that's what Ephesians is all about. You know, Ephesians is this big cosmic vision, but God's design is to sum it all up in Christ. And there's that to and fro, the coming together of heaven and earth, of Jew and Gentile, of male and female, which characterizes that whole book. So I see that as simply, let's live in the real world and celebrate it and enjoy it. And if our theology isn't big enough to cope with that, well, get a bigger biblical theology.
An issue that we've been around a number of times in the last couple of days is really the whole issue of accountability, authority, and so on. In the Christian State Church, a whole chapter is dedicated to the importance within Anglican thinking, at least, of bishops, of episcopal leadership in effective missiology. And that's an idea that's been repeated in the bishop mission orders, for example, which have a small clause which speak about cyber church and so on. So my question would be, how would you see episcopal leadership mapping out in the digital space? And I suppose particularly my particular question within that question would be, if bishops are seen as a link to the historical church and a tradition that hasn't been invented last week, how would that manifest itself? What could bishops do for us to link cyber church more effectively to the apostolic church?
Yeah, that's very